Congress, for federal agencies, and in courts to advance equality in the fields of workforce and pay, pregnancy discrimination, sexual harassment and violence, reproductive autonomy, and protection of the LGBTQ+ individuals. Enshrining this protection in our Constitution also ensures enduring protection for all Americans across the country. Existing legal protections against sex-based discrimination fall well short of addressing the systemic sex-based inequality in our society. It's also a signal to the courts that they should apply a more rigorous level of review to laws and government policies that discriminate on the basis of sex. That is what the ERA is all about: equality, the most fundamental of American values. We need to finally get the job done. Last Congress, a bipartisan majority of the Senate co-sponsored this joint resolution, and the House of Representatives has already passed this legislation on 2 occasions, first in the 116th Congress and then in the 117th Congress. Virginia became the 38th and final state required by the Constitution to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment on January 27, 2020. Our resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 4, would clarify once and for all that the Equal Rights Amendment has met all the requirements of Article 5 of our Constitution. Let me read what it says: that notwithstanding any time limit contained in HJR 208, the 92nd Congress, as agreed to in the Senate on March 22, 1972, the article of amendment proposed to the states in that joint resolution is valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution, having been ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. It's a clarification resolution. Congress has the power to do it. Congress approved it by more than the required 2/3 majority in both chambers, and 3/4 of states have now ratified it. Article 5 of the Constitution has been complied with. You're going to hear legal arguments surrounding whether Senate Joint Resolution can remove a deadline. So let me talk about some of these issues. First, in the Constitution. Mr. President, there is nothing in the Constitution that sets a time limit on ratification. Read Article 5. It talks about the votes necessary in Congress. We've had that. And the votes of ratification by the states. We've done that. There is no time limit in the Constitution. The 27th Amendment, affecting congressional pay raise, was ratified after 2 centuries, after being initially proposed by Congress as part of the Bill of Rights in 1791. 2 centuries before, over 200 years before it was ratified. Congress has the authority to act. There's precedent for this. Congress extended the deadline for the ratification of amendment as it did once before for the ERA. Note that the ERA deadline was contained in the preamble to the text of the constitutional amendment, not in the constitutional amendment itself. There is precedent for Congress to declare that the requisite number of states have ratified a constitutional amendment, as the House and Senate did in 1992 by resolutions affirming the validity of the 27th Amendment regarding congressional pay raise. That's the one that took over 200 years to ratify. In terms of under Article 5, the only question is whether a state has ratified. Ratification is something that happens at a moment in time. It either happens or it doesn't happen. History tells us that once a state has ratified, it can't take it back. The 14th Amendment became part of the Constitution after the Civil War, even though 2 states had attempted to rescind prior to ratification. Those states were included on the list of states that ratified. The effectiveness of rescission is ultimately a question for Congress. Senate Joint Resolution 4 answers that question. And then the most recent opinion by the Department of Justice, the opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel, noted that Congress, as a co-equal branch of government, is not precluded from taking further action regarding the ratification of the ERA. So we have all of the legal requirements. We can act. Now let me just add a few more things here. Most Americans believe the ERA is already part of our Constitution. Just ask them. They think it's there. Most of our states have provisions in the state constitutions to provide equal rights based upon sex. So we already have it in states, and it's working. Most democracies, in fact, every constitution that's been written since World War II, contains an equal rights amendment. The United States is an outlier on this issue. It's in we're the leader of democratic values and human rights globally, but we don't have an equal rights amendment in our Constitution. The Pew Research Center did a survey on this. 78% of Americans support the Equal Rights Amendment being added to the Constitution. This is overwhelmingly popular among all of our constituents, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, men, women. 250 national and local groups support the ERA, including the League of Women Voters, the National Urban League, the National Council of Jewish Women, SEIU, and many, many, many other civil rights, labor, and civic groups. This resolution language removes any doubt of ratification, and it is the right way to go under our Constitution. We have the advice of constitutional scholars that support what we are doing. Erwin Chemerinsky, Larry Tribe, Kathleen Sullivan, Catherine McKinnon, Victoria Nourse, former Senator Russ Feingold, all have endorsed the way that we are proceeding. The ERA is needed not only to keep progress moving forward, but also to protect against incursions on the progress we've already made. Based on recent decisions by the Supreme Court, some justices ascribe to the view that the meaning of equality under the Equal Protection Clause should be frozen in time in 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified. That approach may cast in doubt even the limited precedent currently holding the Equal Protection Clause applies to sex discrimination. It's been more than 100 years since women won the right to vote, and nearly 100 since the effort to enshrine the ERA into the Constitution began. Generations have fought to achieve major points of progress in our laws and our societies since then. However, it's undeniable that work remains. Finally, enshrining the ERA into the Constitution would be one major step that we could take towards a society that is truly equal on the basis of sex. I therefore urge my colleagues to vote yes on the motion to invoke cloture, on the motion to proceed to Senate Joint Resolution 4. The women of America have waited long.
And senators, in accordance with the provision of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, to hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 121, Michael Farbiaz of New Jersey, to be United States District Judge for the District of New Jersey, signed by 20 senators as follows.
Consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and the motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 122.
The questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Robert Kirsch of New Jersey, to be United States District Judge for the District of New Jersey.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 122, Robert Kirsch of New Jersey, to be United States District Judge for the District of New Jersey, signed by 20 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and the motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 123.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do
send the
have it,
clerk-
and
I
the
send
motion
the-
is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Oriella Aletta Merchant of New York to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of New York.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 123, Oriella Aletta Merchant of New York to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of New York, signed by 20 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Finally, I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today, April 26, be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration of S-Res 175 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 175, recognizing the importance of the 70th anniversary of the signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Republic of Korea on October 1st, 1953.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, tomorrow it'll be a great honor of the House and Senate to welcome President Yoon of the Republic of Korea to the U.S. Capitol. Ahead of President Yoon's visit, Leader McConnell, Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Rich, and I wish to welcome him through a bipartisan resolution reaffirming the strong support that exists for the U.S.-Korean relationship. 70 years of this partnership have made both our nations safer, more prosperous, and more intertwined than ever. Today, millions of Americans know and love Korean music, Korean cinema, Korean food, and Korean goods and products. K-pop now goes viral in our country, and for many Americans, their favorite movies are not in English, but in Korean. The Korean-American community embodies what the American dream has always been about, coming to our country and building something of yourself, building strong families that enrich our communities and make our nation more prosperous. New York is proud to have one of the largest, most dynamic Korean communities anywhere in the country, and I've been proud to fight for them here in the Senate. They're a wonderful addition to New York, and the more Koreans there are in New York, the better we're going to be. And make no mistake, the U.S. and the Republic of Korea need each other more than ever. As we continue to compete with China, the Republic of Korea is among our closest partners, and as we confront a belligerent North Korea, we must work with the Republic of Korea for our mutual safety. I also want to applaud President Yoon for beginning the process to revitalize his nation's relationship with Japan. When we work together, we can make real strides to ensure security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. Again, I thank my colleagues for working with me on this resolution. We thank President Yoon for coming to the Capitol, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, first of all, I have to thank my colleague, Senator Cardin, along with Senator Murkowski, for bringing the Senate joint resolution 4 that we will be voting on tomorrow. We need the Equal Rights Amendment today more than ever. What we have been seeing across the country is the far right using every opportunity they can to roll back women's rights. We're seeing this happen in real time with access to abortion care, and we know it won't stop there. So it's shameful that in 2023 there are so many extremists who want to make women second-class citizens. But that's why we need a constitutional amendment to protect women from discrimination and guarantee their equality under the law. Few states understand this better than my home state of Nevada. Nevada put the Equal Rights Amendment back on the table when it became the first state in the modern era to ratify the ERA in 2017. Nevada's Nevadans stood up and made it clear that our state believes men and women should have equal legal rights. And they didn't stop there. In 2022, Nevada adopted the most comprehensive ERA in the country in its state constitution, putting protections in place to ensure equal rights for all. Over and over again, Nevadans have led the charge for equality and women's rights at both the state and the federal level. Now, since Nevada kicked off the push in recent years to ratify the ERA federally, we now have the 38 states we need to codify the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States Constitution. The only thing that's stopping us is a deadline Congress made up in 1972 that was already extended once. That's why we must vote to remove this deadline and adopt the Equal Rights Amendment into our Constitution, because, quite honestly, Mr. President, there's too much at stake. And to let an arbitrary time limit hold women's rights hostage is just wrong. So with that, along with my colleagues here this afternoon, I too urge the adoption tomorrow of Senate Joint Resolution, bipartisan Joint Resolution 4. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I'm so proud to be here with my colleagues today and Senator Cortez Masto and all of our other colleagues and with our leaders, Senator Cardin, Senator Murkowski, and a bipartisan resolution that frankly is long overdue. You know, there's a sign you often see at rallies for reproductive rights. A woman my age or older will often be holding it, and it reads something like this: "I can't believe we're still fighting for this crap." Now, it usually has a different word on it than crap. As I stand here on the Senate floor in the year of our Lord 2023, I can't believe we are still fighting for equal rights for women under our American Constitution. We are 100 years out from when the Equal Rights Amendment was first introduced in 1923. A full century, 100 years since it was first introduced. And a lot of things have changed since 1923, for sure. Women are CEOs and astronauts, professional athletes and chemistry professors and governors and vice president of the United States. A quarter of the members of this chamber are women. Not nearly enough, but we're getting there. Yet, still, 100 years later, women are not guaranteed equal legal protections, equal legal rights under our Constitution. That needed to change in 1923, and it certainly needs to change 100 years later in 2023. Michigan was ready for change back in 1972. That's when my state ratified the ERA. And a congresswoman from Michigan helped lead the way. Congresswoman Martha Griffiths of Detroit was the first woman in history to serve on the House Ways and Means Committee. In 1970, she filed a discharge petition to send the legislation to the full House of Representatives for consideration. It passed, only to die in the Senate. We've heard that story before. But Representative Griffiths was undaunted. She introduced an amended version. The House and the Senate both passed it, and it was sent to the states for ratification in 1972. Congresswoman Griffiths later served as Michigan's first elected lieutenant governor and became known as the mother of the ERA. Congresswoman Griffiths sadly didn't live to see her amendment written into the Constitution, but there is no doubt we need it today even more than we did in 1972. Women in this country are watching our reproductive freedoms be dismantled. The Dobbs decision, attempts to ban the abortion pill, and harsh Abortion restrictions in states have left women in this country with fewer freedoms than our mothers and even our grandmothers enjoyed. The ERA is really simple. It simply says, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Equal rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. And this resolution is equally simple, the one before us. All it would do is to remove an arbitrary deadline that was included when this was passed through Congress, preventing the ERA from being ratified. The ERA is simple, but its protections would be profound. It would protect all people, regardless of sex, from discrimination. It would defend against the rollback of our fundamental rights and freedoms. Congresswoman Martha Griffiths from Michigan passed it. The states ratified it. Now we just need to add it to our Constitution. Our daughters and our granddaughters can't wait another 100 years. They deserve equality now. So I hope colleagues will join with us to pass this resolution and finally ensure all people are equal under our law. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
I want to thank Senator Stabenow for her leadership in the Senate and in our community on these issues. I serve with her and Senator Cortez Masto on the Finance Committee, and I see the duo there fighting for removing a lot of the discrimination we have in our healthcare system against that women are discriminated against. And both of these senators do a great job being here, protecting the rights. But it's so important that we have in our toolbox the constitutional amendment to help us in fighting discrimination so that we have a fair playing field in the courts to protect the rights of women. So I thank her. We're also joined by Senator Klobuchar. She's been, we were elected at the same time to the United States Senate. She's been an advocate on behalf of equality for all communities, but particularly her efforts on behalf of women is known throughout the nation. I'm glad she could join us today.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I rise to join Senator Cardin, thanking him for his leadership for so many years, as well as Senator Murkowski and to my colleague Senator Stabenow, in support of this bipartisan resolution to remove the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment so we can finally enshrine equal rights for women into our Constitution. What are people afraid of? Minnesota ratified the ERA 50 years ago. Since then, women and men who stand with them have never rested in the fight to guarantee equality in the Constitution of the United States of America. After a half-century of overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles, that long-fought battle for equality must not come down to an arbitrary deadline. Passing the resolution will bring us one step closer to ratifying the ERA and finally enshrining permanent protections for women and girls in our Constitution. The Equal Rights Amendment would make clear once and for all that women are guaranteed equal rights under the United States Constitution. The core of the amendment is only 24 words long, guaranteeing that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. In 1972, the amendment passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support. The Senate voted to send the amendment to the states by a vote of 84-8, with 7 not voting, and the House passed it 354-24. Congress initially set a 7-year deadline for the required 3/4 of states to ratify the amendment, and it later extended the deadline by 3 more years. By the time that deadline expired, only 35 states had ratified, leaving the amendment 3 states short of the 38 needed. But the deadline did not stop the growing support for the ERA and women's equality. Since then, 3 additional states have voted to ratify the ERA, including Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia. It is long past time that the equality of women be enshrined in the Constitution. I have been proud to join a bipartisan group of senators in co-sponsoring this resolution. This resolution is part of a long tradition of bipartisan support for the ERA. The past year has made it painfully clear that protecting equality remains fundamental to the lives of each and every American. As my colleagues have noted, the women of this country still face a gender pay gap that leaves them economically behind. Women still earn around 82 cents of every dollar a man makes, and for women of color, it's even less. 10 months ago, we saw the Supreme Court issue a rule shredding nearly 5 decades of precedent, protecting a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Now women are at the mercy of a patchwork of state laws governing their ability to access reproductive care, leaving them with fewer rights than their moms and grandmas. Every branch of government has a responsibility to protect people's rights. And if one branch fails to do so, the Constitution gives Congress and the people the power to step in by proposing and ratifying a new amendment. Ratifying the ERA would affirm that sex discrimination is inconsistent with the nation's core value of equal protection under the law. We know that the majority of Americans on our side, 78% of Americans, according to Pew Research Center, support the ERA being added to the Constitution. 78% of Americans. We know this proposal is common sense. This year marks the 101st anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, a critical milestone in our democracy. At this moment in our country's history, I am as committed as ever to fighting to ensure that all Americans are guaranteed equality under the law. Let's show the world that the United States of America is a place where equality is the law of the land. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
The Majority Whip.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague from Minnesota, and I especially thank my colleague from Maryland. The senator from Maryland has been working on this issue for a long time, and Ben, thank you for your leadership. And Lisa Murkowski, making it a bipartisan effort. I've got a good speech here, but I want to tell you a story. And the story goes back to my graduation from law school and the first job I ever had. I was working for the lieutenant governor of the state of Illinois, a man named Paul Simon, who went on to be elected to Congress and to the United States Senate. Simon, as lieutenant governor of Illinois, presided over the Illinois State Senate. We had met one another, and he said he was going to offer me a job when I graduated from law school, and lo and behold, I became parliamentarian of the Illinois State Senate, fresh out of law school. Skipped my graduation ceremony because I desperately needed some money to pay off some bills, and started working in Springfield, Illinois as parliamentarian of the State Senate. Simon mistakenly believed that there was a course in law school called parliamentary law. There wasn't. I had to learn it by just reading the rule book over and over again until it became familiar. But eventually I was pretty good at it. And I needed to be, because we had a big debate going on in Springfield, Illinois in the early 1970s about something called the Equal Rights Amendment. It was different than the debate in many state capitals because there was a real confrontation. There was no party identity behind or for the Equal Rights Amendment. Some Republicans supported it, many Democrats supported it, but there was opposition on both parties too. What fired up the troops on that particular debate was the presence of a woman from Alton, Illinois, named Phyllis Schlafly, who was leading the national effort to stop the Equal Rights Amendment. I reflect on that this evening because I remember what she used to say. If you pass the Equal Rights Amendment, men and women are going to use the same bathrooms. And not only that, women are going to be forced to fight in combat in the military. They'll be drafted and they'll be off fighting in military. And I look back on those arguments now and say, is that it? Was that really the debate on the equality of women in America came down to those two issues? I thought of it the other day when I went into a school that I was visiting and they had a same-gender restroom. Take a single-member restroom, but either gender could use it. And I thought, Phyllis Schlafly's dream came true. We are sharing the same restrooms in some places. And when it comes to combat in the military, many women across the United States fought for that right to do so and have served our country honorably. But those were the arguments and the differences of the day which led the debate and led to Illinois not ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. That didn't happen until very recently. We had a hearing on this, as you know, Mr. President, in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I listened to the critics of the Equal Rights Amendment today. I didn't hear anything about same-sex restrooms and nothing about combat in the military, but one lady raised the prospect that if we passed the Equal Rights Amendment, it would ruin her daughter's field hockey team in high school because there may be some transgender individuals wanting to play on her daughter's team. And I thought to myself, so now it's come down to that. It's no longer restrooms or combat pay. It's a question of field hockey for young ladies. Well, I know that's an important part of their lives, and she told us as much. But when I reflect on what the reality of this amendment does, it seems that those things pale in comparison. The language of it is so express and so clear that most people in the United States really would be surprised to know it's not already in the Constitution. No discrimination against people on the basis of sex. Most people assume that's the fact, but it's not. We have to do something about it. Tonight, we're seeing the Senate at its best, a bipartisan effort on the floor of the United States Senate to finally make this right by America. The Equal Rights Amendment is literally a century in the making, and over the years, generations of Americans have done their part to push it forward. They've marched on Washington, they've met with congressmen and senators, and as of 2020, they've crossed a crucial threshold, ratification of the ERA in 38 states. That's the exact number of states needed to certify it as the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So now it's time for lawmakers in Congress to do our part in supporting the ERA. We need to clear a path for equality. And this proposal, this bipartisan proposal from Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, is our chance to do it. It will remove the arbitrary deadline Congress imposed on ERA ratification more than 50 years ago, and removing that deadline has never been more important. As we learned over the past year, there is no room for uncertainty when it comes to protecting equal rights. Right now, women all across America are living with the reality that their fundamental freedoms are under attack. In the months since the disastrous Dobbs decision, millions of Americans have been robbed of their reproductive rights. Activist judges and far-right politicians have replaced the will of the people and the expertise of medical professionals with their own radical beliefs. And women living in states like Texas, Oklahoma, and most recently Florida and North Dakota have fewer rights today than their parents and grandparents did decades ago. All of this chaos and confusion is jeopardizing the lives of women and upending our healthcare system. We had another hearing today. There was testimony in that hearing by a young lady from Texas who went through an awful ordeal at the end of a pregnancy which she wanted desperately. It was her first child. It would have been her first daughter. Willow was the name that she'd given her. And then late in the pregnancy, complications arose, and Willow was unfortunately couldn't be born, and the mother almost died waiting to comply with the new Texas law on abortion. I'm going to remember that testimony for a long time. Without ERA protections, even basic rights like reproduction are on the chopping block. Protection against discrimination in the workplace, in the classroom, even in the courtroom. Unless women's rights are explicitly protected under the Constitution, there's nothing stopping the right-wing majority on the court from ripping them away. That's why Congress must restore and protect women's rights in all facets of life. We can do it this week by clearing the way to finally enshrine gender equality in the Constitution. I had the honor of presiding over a hearing on this very proposal in the Senate Judiciary Committee several weeks ago. During that hearing, we heard from a young woman whose name was Thursday Williams, first-generation American, board member of the ERA Coalition, senior at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Ms. Williams is planning on attending law school after she graduates from college. She says she developed a passion for the law when she, quote, fell in love with the United States Constitution in high school. In her words, and I quote her, "What I love the most about the Constitution is how brilliantly it was designed to adapt to the changing needs of its people. And today, we deserve a Constitution that guarantees equality regardless of sex, a Constitution that we can use as a tool to fight discrimination." That was her testimony. Ms. Williams concluded by asking members of the committee a question. It's a question I would like to now ask every member of the Senate. How can we be the beacon of freedom and democracy we claim to be if we do not declare that sex discrimination contradicts the American dream? That was Thursday Williams' question to the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's my question to the Senate on her behalf. If we want to live up to the promise of America, we need to protect the rights of every American. Let's start with the ERA. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
first I want to thank Senator Durbin, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, for his leadership on this issue, but just as importantly, his leadership on so many human rights and civil rights issues. Thank you for the hearing that you conducted in the Judiciary Committee. It shed light on a lot of the ridiculous arguments that some have made against the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. But more importantly, it showed why it's important for us to remove any ambiguity on the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. But I also want to just acknowledge your extraordinary leadership around the world. When there's a human rights struggle, Senator Durbin is going to be the spokesperson for those otherwise would not be heard. And I join him many times in those efforts. I'm proud to be on his team, and I thank him for really giving us the leadership here in the United States Senate, the best values of America, here at home and abroad. So I thank him for his leadership on this issue and so many other issues. Mr. President, we're joined by a couple of my other colleagues. First, Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut. I also want to acknowledge Senator Van Hollen from Maryland. Both have been real leaders in regards to the equal rights of women, but also in regards to, again, civil liberties and civil rights. Both are good friends. One I have the honor of representing in the state of Maryland. I've seen him in action for equal rights in our state. The other, we've been together on the Helsinki Commission fighting globally for human rights. So I thank them for being on the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm so honored by that introduction and to be here on the floor with a great colleague, a champion in the House as well as now in the Senate, Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. And I thank the senior senator, we were both senior senators from our respective states from Maryland, for yielding first to me. And more important, I want to thank him for his leadership on human rights and civil rights here in the United States. He has been such a powerful advocate, but also around the world through the Helsinki Commission. I've had the great privilege of working with him and serving with him on that commission, where he has put front and center the crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine, as well as other parts of the world where the rule of law, unfortunately, is lacking. And so I am very, very proud to be with him on the floor today. Like my colleague, Senator Durbin, who has been rightly lauded by Senator Cardin for his work on rights, I rise to ask this body and all who are hearing this message to commit to making the Equal Rights Amendment the law of our land, a part of the Constitution. Outside of the right to vote, the Constitution has no mention of gender equality. It was enshrined, the right to vote, just over a century ago by the 19th Amendment, but the United States Constitution does not exclude an explicit provision on equal rights for women. And that is a sad omission that cannot be allowed to stand. We must fix it. The ERA, as you know, was introduced to Congress in 1923 by the suffragette leader Alice Paul, who believed that after securing the right to vote, women needed legal protection against discrimination. That fact is no less true today than it was then. In 1972, the ERA was passed by Congress. In 2020, Virginia became the 38th and final state required by the Constitution to ratify it. In January 22, we passed the 2-year waiting period. President Biden has supported making it the law of the land. We should heed President Biden and this body in doing so and recognizing the importance of a resolution ratifying the ERA. Now, the hard, blunt truth here is that significant progress in sex equality has been made thanks to a generation of advocates, actually several generations. But women and girls still face horrendous, life-changing barriers and challenges derived from structural sex discrimination every day. And I became more aware of it as a dad to a young woman, listening to her, seeing the world through her eyes, as well as my wife, Cynthia, both of them strong advocates, and thankfully, my 3 sons as well, who are ardent champions of gender equality. In the workplace, the gender gap has hardly budged. You are, I'm sure, aware that women now earn about 84 cents for every dollar a man earns. That's a statistic from the Department of Labor, and the disparity is even larger for women of color. For every dollar a man earns, Native American women and Latinas earn 57 cents, and black women earn 67 cents. That's in the greatest country in the history of the world. We should be ashamed and embarrassed. Ashamed and embarrassed. The ERA is a critical step toward ensuring equality and protecting women's fundamental rights, including the right to abortion and conception. The Supreme Court overturned 5 decades of precedent, eliminated the constitutional right to abortion in Dobbs, saying Roe was wrong, a decision that will go down in infamy as one of the most destructive to the court's credibility, as I mentioned today, a tribute to the disingenuousness of 3 nominees before this body, the 3 most recent nominees, who said they would respect precedent and then voted to completely overturn Dobbs within a couple of years. About 1 in 3 girls and women in the United States of reproductive age are living in states where abortion is either unavailable or severely restricted. And the adverse consequences of for women's health are already clearly visible. Amanda Zurowski today testified before the Judiciary Committee about how she nearly died, nearly perished from sepsis because of Texas's cruel, barbarous prohibitions against women's health care through abortion. Without the freedom to control their own lives, bodies, and futures, true meaning of equality will remain elusive and out of reach. As Justice Ginsburg put it, full and equal citizenship, quote, is intimately connected to a person's ability to control their reproductive lives, end quote. The ERA would also provide additional tools against violence committed all too often against women. Gender-based violence is a form of sex discrimination as well as a violation of human rights. 35% of all women who are killed by men are a result of violence from intimate partners with guns. 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 5 women in the United States have been raped. You can dispute the specific numbers, but the overwhelming truth of sex discrimination in violence, in denial of health care, in job inequality, in pay discrimination is there for all to see. We all know it exists. We must act against it. And that is why I'm proud to stand here with my colleagues and argue that ratification is an idea long overdue. It's not an idea whose time has come. It came long ago. And we have an obligation to act as a matter of conscience and conviction. If we care about women in the United States of America in the 21st century, we need to bring the law into the 21st century and do what should have been done long ago to protect women's health and security, as well as fundamental equality. Let me just close with a favorite quote of mine from Susan Anthony. And she stated, "The true republic, men their rights and nothing more. Women their rights and nothing less. Sex equality deserves a permanent home in the Constitution. The time to make it happen is now." Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, let me thank my colleague from Connecticut for his words in support of the Equal Rights Amendment and for his fight for justice. And let me also thank my colleague, my Maryland partner and friend, Senator Cardin, for teaming up with Senator Murkowski to push for passage of this legislation year after year. It's long overdue that we take this up and that we pass it in the United States Senate. If you look at our history, during the darkest of times and against the longest of odds, Americans from all backgrounds have stood together to insist that America live up to its promise. The promise of equality, the promise of equal rights for all. In fact, if you think about the story of America, it really is the story of the struggle to make good on that fundamental promise, to ensure that every individual receives equal dignity. We talk about how we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that's true. They're not more rights for men, they're not supposed to be more rights for any particular group. It's supposed to be about equal dignity. And equal dignity should include equal treatment under the law. Now, in their fight for voting rights, our nation's suffragettes faced unjust arrest, they faced persecution, they faced resistance from a nation that was not yet willing to fulfill that full promise when it came to voting rights. And despite it all, through protests, through demands, through arrests, the suffragettes prevailed and made sure that we passed the 19th Amendment, at least fulfilling the right to vote for women. But we have a lot of unfinished business. You know, it's not just all men who were created equal, it's all people who were created equal. We have accomplished that when it comes to the ballot box, although as we in this body know, we also have a long way to go to make sure that that is made real in practice on the ground. That's why we've been fighting to pass voting rights legislation. But we also need to make sure that when it comes to women's rights, we enshrine it in the highest law of the land in order to give the rhetoric legal teeth and legal backing. Alice Paul, who really is the founder of the movement for the Equal Rights Amendment, knew that a century ago when she said, and I quote, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated. But to me," she said, "there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." And there is great truth in the simplicity of that statement. And that's what the Equal Rights is all about. It's not a lot of words, but they're the rightly chosen words. Quote, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state.
Thank you to the cable and satellite companies who provide C-SPAN to viewers as a public service.
Ratified it enough to make the ERA our 28th Amendment, and yet 100 years after the proposed amendment was first introduced to Congress, despite this broad support, the ratification of the necessary number of states, we have not yet made that part of our Constitution. And the results are painfully clear every day. My colleagues have talked about some of them. The persistent pay gap, which disadvantages not only women, but also the families that they support. Recent rulings by the Supreme Court on reproductive rights have shown that the lack of an explicit protection against gender discrimination puts women's fundamental rights at risk and on the chopping block. So this is the moment to finally get this done. I again want to thank Senator Cardin and Senator Murkowski for their efforts to move forward on this. I want to thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And as I close, I do want to say a few words about my friend and colleagues from Maryland's long-term fight for this, and applaud him for over a decade of working to make sure that we get the ERA across the finish line. It's been one and very important aspect, in fact, the cornerstone of many of his efforts here in the United States, but it's a reflection of his fights for civil rights, for women's rights, for racial rights, and for human rights around the world. And I want to thank him for his persistence on this and so many issues that call upon us to be what we say we are as Americans, people who believe in the equal dignity of every individual and the rights of every individual. So I want to thank my colleague. I want to thank him for teaming up with Senator Murkowski from Alaska and thank her for her efforts. I said at the beginning that we have been defined as an American story by our struggle to make good on that original promise, the idea of equal rights. Many people have tried to interpret it different ways, but I think we all understand at the end of the day, the North Star is equal rights, means equal rights for everybody, not just equal rights for some people over here, because that's not equal rights. And that's as simple as what brings us here to the floor. And I want to thank my colleague again from Maryland for keeping this fight going. I really hope my Republican colleagues will take this moment, despite what we expect, to enshrine that simple proposition into the Constitution of the United States. I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I'm glad today to stand with my colleagues to support Senate Joint Resolution 4, affirming the validity of the Equal Rights Amendment. We have heard from Senator Cardin and Senator Murkowski why it is so important for Congress to pass this resolution and enshrine protections against sex-based discrimination in our Constitution. The ERA would bolster efforts to ensure equality in the fields of workforce and pay, pregnancy discrimination, sexual harassment and violence, reproductive autonomy, and protections for LGBTQ individuals. Although we have indeed made strides in each of these areas, we know how fragile these gains can be without the durability of a constitutional amendment. Take, for example, the current Supreme Court's approach to the Constitution. As the Dobbs decision makes clear, a majority of the current court believes that the meaning of equality under the Equal Protection Clause was frozen in in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was ratified. Well, in the 100 years after 1868, the Supreme Court has adopted and permitted all sorts of state laws that excluded women from jury service, that excluded women from admission to the bar as lawyers, that excluded women even from employment as bartenders, and allowed all of those laws under the 14th Amendment. This business now of the Supreme Court looking back at history and tradition is a backward look to bad history and regrettable tradition. So with this Supreme Court, it is particularly important that we not rely on its interpretation of the 14th Amendment alone to guarantee equal rights. Congress needs to stand up and act, and we have the power to do so. Congress has broad authority over the amendment process. If Congress has the power to impose a time limit, Congress has the power to extend or remove that time limit. I join my colleagues to urge swift passage of this resolution. As one witness at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on the ERA eloquently put it, gender equality is not a zero-sum game. We are all uplifted when everyone's rights are protected. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
I want to thank Senator Whitehouse for his leadership on the Equal Rights Amendment, but he is our leader on protecting our democratic institutions, which include equality for all. Senator Whitehouse's leadership in protecting the election process and protecting us against dark money and an independent judiciary will go down in history as one of the great contributions made. And I thank him for his help in regards to the Equal Rights Amendment, and I thank him for his leadership on so many issues here in the United States Senate. Mr. President, let me just conclude this part of our discussion. We'll have a chance tomorrow to vote on this. What we're asking is very simple: to put the Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution without any ambiguity, remove a time limit. We've already done everything necessary for its ratification. This document's a precious document, the Constitution of the United States. Most Americans believe the Equal Rights Amendment's in this document. It's not. The consequences are that we're not protecting women's rights, discrimination against sex, in the manner we should be protecting it. Now, the vote tomorrow is going to be on a cloture motion. You see, Mr. President, the majority of the members of the Senate support the resolution that Senator Murkowski and I are bringing forward. And the way they stop it, the way the minority can stop it, is by denying us an opportunity to vote up or down on the resolution. This is a matter of rights. I would hope that my colleagues would support the resolution, but at least allow the majority of this body to make the decision on this resolution. I hope my colleagues will vote for the cloture motion so that we can have a vote on the floor of the United States Senate on this resolution, which for once and for all make it clear equal rights is part of the American Constitution, part of our commitment to future generations. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.